SFBBO, promoting sustainability by engaging communities for more than 40 years. Our Birdy Hour speaker series is a free virtual program. On July 9th, 2024, Dr. Eric Wood gave a talk titled Global Change, Biodiversity, and Conservation for our community.
So, hello, I'm Eric Wood. I'm a professor at California State University, Los Angeles. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cal State L.A., it's in the same system as San Jose State University, San Francisco State University, and 21 other CSUs all up and down the state. I'm originally from the Bay Area. I was born actually in Santa Clara, close by to where you all are. My dad is from Cupertino. I've got lots of family in San Jose. I was actually raised in Santa Rosa. And just a brief background about me and how I got to this point where I'm at right now. I did my undergrad at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I was a biology major there, master's degree at Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt, and then a PhD in the University of Wisconsin and a postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology before moving out back this way to start my position. And I'm thrilled to be at Cal State L.A. The CSU has been great to me, going to undergrad at Cal Poly and being up at Humboldt. And I'm excited to be having a position where I can just think about birds all day long and take students out in the field. So it's a lot of fun. So what I'm going to do today is just share some about what my lab has been doing over the past decade. I've been in my position for 10 years now. And this is kind of a smorgasbord of certain projects we're working on, but I'm really going to focus on one big one that's sort of our big baby right now that we're doing, and I'll get into the details, but you can see the title right here. And that's the effects of over a century of urbanization on the avifauna of the LA basin. You're going to hear a lot about LA today. A lot of our research is it's under this umbrella of urban ecology. It's basically just studying ecology within urban ecosystems, and that's really one of the hottest subfields in ecology across the world right now. And I couldn't think of a better place to be doing it than LA for lots of reasons. One, because there's a lot of work and a lot of room to improve in Los Angeles. I love living there, but there's certainly some things that need to be improved. So it's fun to be thinking about that and ways to advocate for development that benefits both people and biodiversity. And that's certainly what we do in my lab. So let's just get into it a little bit. Let me see if I can get this thing going. Okay, here we go. And if you guys want, you can ask questions as we're going. You can, however you want to do it. And then I will also be just sitting around when we're all done to answer any questions that you have. So I'm imagining we're in a room together and I can just see all your hands. How many of you know about Los Angeles? I'm sure many of you do, whether you had lived there for a period of your life or been through there. It's, of course, a very iconic city. And this is a very iconic photo. This is downtown LA, very famous downtown LA. And this is in the late 1800s. The Los Angeles River moving from north to south as it comes out from the Elysian Valley. Of course, it's all channelized now, but you can definitely see this early formation of the city. You can start seeing the grids. You can definitely notice all the agriculture that was in the fields surrounding the Los Angeles River. And the joke is, of course, many, many things have changed on that river. Of course, famous movies have been shot there. They've channelized it. They've done so many things to it. And that's really just emblematic of the entire area in general over the past 100 years. There have been so many changes. Likely no other city in the country has changed as much during the 19th century. And of course, LA is one of the most iconic cities on the planet now for its entertainment, for its culture, cultural influence, whatever it is. One thing that I do often when I'm driving around LA, and I do this too when I'm back home in the Bay Area or just anywhere, and I'm sure many of you do this too, is it's just hard to not to wonder what it used to look like. Of course, we can look at Hollywood or something like you see in the image here, and it looks fun and razzle-dazzle and all that, but you always kind of wonder about what used to be there. And that's something that many of us down here are thinking about, and we have a research team that's been doing this. And so what I want to start with in this presentation is just this idea about understanding the past distributions of birds throughout greater LA, and to see what we've lost and also what remains in the area. Of course, it's easy to just think that you develop a big city like LA and you just obliterate everything, all the natural ecosystems and no more birds and all that. But it's a much more complicated tale than that. And it's going to be the same thing if you were to do the same type of project in the Bay Area. And there are a lot of people thinking about the same things up there as well. So, what I'm going to do for the very first part of this presentation is to go over these first five things. And first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the historical timeline and the growth of LA. That's important just to set the stage for some of the things that I'm going to be discussing. I'm going to talk about some databases that we use. We're a very quantitative lab, we're a very field based lab, but at least for this project right here, we're using data that were already available. And so there's some databases that I want to share with you that are quite cool, where you can do some really interesting things in terms of recreating the historical avifauna. I'll get into some analyses. I'm not going to bore you with all that. We spend a lot of time thinking about statistics in my lab, and I'm a very statistics focused person. I teach classes in statistics, but I won't bore you with those details, but just to share a few in case people are interested. Then I'll get into some results and some conservation implications for what we're going to talk about. Okay, so look at this lovely photo. If you're going to go take a dip in the ocean, you may do it with oil derricks all behind you. And this was a common scene. You could see this in places like Venice Beach and Huntington Beach and Santa Monica, very famous places in LA that used to be all about oil. And that's what I'm going to talk about really quick here with this brief timeline. So, of course, some of this stuff is just review for all of us, but just to set the stage. So, of course, indigenous peoples lived and thrived in California for many, many years before the colonial period. That was going on during the mid 1700s and 1880s. Of course, we're familiar with the Spanish missionary and also ranchero period, which was very influential and important down in Southern California. Following statehood in the 1850s, that's really when California began to take off. And of course, if you're from the Bay Area, you know what a lot of people in LA love to do is think they're the center of the world and the center of attention. But of course, at this time, the center of it all was San Francisco. Of course, you had that big, beautiful port. The Sierra Nevadas were close by to get people up for looking for gold or whatever it could be in that time. And it really wasn't LA at all. LA at that point wasn't much of anything. LA had no natural ports. It was very water limited, and it was relatively far from the action up in the Sierra Nevada. And it really began its growth at the turn of the century following the discovery of oil, hence that picture in the background that I was talking about, that image of Venice Beach, Huntington Beach, places that you would see these oil derricks at. So LA really was an oil town. And you can see that as you're just driving around, you can still see pump jacks all throughout the city. And that's really the character of the town, the historic character of the town. So, following the discovery of oil and the development of some transcontinental railroads and eventually the diversion of water in 1913, that's really when everything just began to take off. And that's really the first major boom periods, basically in the 1920s and the roaring 20s. And what I want to do, and the reason why I'm talking about this, is I do want to focus on this period right here, around 1920. And so you can see that the population just taking off in the city of LA, this lighter gray line, and also LA County. Now, why is this interesting? So before 1920, there were still very famous naturalists living in the area. Joseph Grinnell is one that comes to mind, who is from the Pasadena area, who, of course, went up to Berkeley and led the Vertebrate Museum up at UC Berkeley and did many, many collections throughout the state. That was going on back then at this time in Los Angeles, too. So what you see in this table, this is by decade from the 1880s to 1890s up into 1920, why I have this highlighted in teal, Go San Jose Sharks, is for when the bird collections were going on. You can see there were tons of bird collections at that time. This is very unique. When you think of a place that at this time in the late 1800s and early 1900s was quite rural, actually, but still people were going out and collecting eggs, collecting nests. This was a big thing back then and this time. Think Darwin, think Wallace. That was all going on in the 1850s, so it's not that much earlier than this. So collections were a big deal. But you had these collections all over the area, and then you didn't have this city, and now, of course, we have this city everywhere. So you could really do this stuff I'm going to tell you about in the next couple of slides for thinking about what the avian community used to be like. Now, people have done this in many cities throughout the world in terms of comparing within the city to the nearby natural areas, but that's really tough in California, as we all know, because the valleys were developed and then the hills and the mountains outside the cities were not. And that's the same thing in Los Angeles, where you just have massive mountains right outside the city. So it's really an apples to pineapples comparison if you just want to go compare the bird communities inside and out. So we had to do this with looking at these historical specimens. Okay, so what did we do here? So there's three databases that we used for the analysis that I'm going to share with you. One, we were using breeding bird, egg, and nest databases, and GBIF is a global repository for specimens. We were using that to locate these breeding bird eggs and nests. Those eggs and nests were actually pinpointed on a map so we can locate or geolocate their area. We were also using a historical potential natural vegetation of LA. That's just the land cover that we think used to be covering Los Angeles. And I'll show you what that used to look like too. And then we had to compare that with some contemporary data. And so we used the breeding bird atlas data. It's not necessarily current. 1995 to 1999 was when the last BBA was done. And I'll explain what a BBA is in a few slides, but it was good enough for our purposes. Okay, so for the eggs and nests, if anybody hasn't been to the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology Museum in Camarillo, you have to go. It's an amazing place. But there, it's one of the largest breeding egg collections in the entire, I believe, world, maybe just the US, but it's in a wonderful place. So they had about 7,000 breeding records for birds throughout LA County. About 2,000 or so fit our criteria for the locations where we were doing our work. And then we grabbed another 1,000 or so from this online database, this GBIF database. So we had about 3,000 eggs and nests where we could say, we know that was a loggerhead shrike. We know that was a yellow-billed cuckoo that was breeding here. We know that was an Anna's hummingbird. And that was really important for what I'm going to share next. So this image right here is the historical land cover of the area. And it doesn't matter so much if you can read this stuff right here. This is the actual land cover types. But if you focus on the map over here on the right, the different shades of colors represent different natural vegetation types. The beige up in the San Fernando Valley and along the coastal plain down near where LAX is, that was coastal, these were dune fields, grasslands, flower fields. In the light gray, this was coastal, or this light green color, coastal sage scrub. You can see the riparian areas and the rivers that were moving through the locations, the Arroyo Seco, the LA River, the San Gabriel River. Okay, so why was this important? Why were these data important? And what was interesting about this? What we thought was, and this is part of the team that I've been a part of, we came up with these estimates about what this land cover was, and we were 50% sure within the grid that it was likely one of these natural land cover types pre-European and American settlement. We also knew that so much of this area, when we were collecting or we were using the egg collections and nests, was urbanized. And so these gray locations, we were able to get some data about the actual existing parcels that were on the landscape as our measure of urbanization. And we couldn't really quantify agriculture because it was too challenging to note if there was branching going on or if there was orchards. That wasn't a part of this, but we just assumed it was on this landscape. Again, we just wanted to assume that 50% of the land cover was what we have in this image. And then I can't see the bottom of that thing because I think my thing is in the way, but these data were used in some statistical models. Okay, so those are two databases. And the last one, the contemporary data, I'm just going to highlight this, is Breeding Bird Atlas. Possibly or perhaps some of you have contributed to a breeding bird atlas before, or you've seen what a breeding bird atlas is. It's a population survey project designed to cover large geographic areas using a grid-based system. In LA, it was roughly these 6-kilometer squared grids. The last one in Los Angeles I mentioned was in 1995 and 1999, and we're redoing it right now. We're just starting to redo it, which is quite exciting. So the next phase is about to happen. And I mentioned it wasn't really current, but it's totally fine for before and after urbanization analyses that we were doing. So what a BBA is all about is surveyors would visit grids and they would document any recorded breeding behavior by birds. So many of us, we use eBird, we use iNaturalist, we love those things. And people ask us all the time, why don't you use those data? And we simply needed confirmed breeding because we were already working with confirmed breeding data from the historical time point. And that's challenging with some of the other data sources. Okay, so with these databases, the eggs, the historical land cover, this new one, we could do some pretty interesting things. So all I'm going to say for the analyses is to recreate the avifauna of the area. We did a bunch of statistics and some predictive modeling of which birds we thought would be in certain vegetation types. Grassland birds, such as the loggerhead shrike, we would model their occurrence based on the distribution of the historic grassland cover. We did that for 96 birds throughout the area, so we really could piece together what we thought the historical breeding bird community used to be in Los Angeles. And then we just compared that with the known breeding areas with the BBA. So I'm going to zoom past these next two slides because it's a lot of details about some boring statistics, but it was basically just what I was talking to you about, that we really did recreate this historical avifauna and compared it to the contemporary times. Okay, so this is the fun stuff, the results. And so what I'm going to do over the next handful of slides is I'm going to show you the distribution, the historic distribution of a bird that was affiliated with a certain type of ecosystem. Then I'm going to show you its contemporary distribution. And then I'm going to show you some reasons, of course, why things have changed for that bird over time. So the first one I'm going to focus on is a grassland bird and the loggerhead shrike. The loggerhead shrike was associated with historical grassland and coastal sage scrub habitats. That's what that CSS is. This curved line just represents their historical occupancy, ranging from 0 to 1 based on the distribution of the grassland and the coastal sage scrub. The more grassland, the more coastal sage scrub you have, which usually tended to occur in a mosaic historically, the more of these birds you would get. So throughout Los Angeles, and I'm just assuming that many of you are familiar with what I'm showing you, this is a huge area. Down here is Palos Verdes, Santa Monica, downtown LA, Cal State L.A. is about right here, Pasadena, the San Fernando Valley. This is a huge area. And loggerhead shrikes were predicted to occur throughout most of them. So the darker shades are where those birds would be. All right. Now, this is where you do the thumbs up or thumbs down, whether you think that bird is still going to be, is going to expand or contract in that area. 1, 3, 2, 1. I'm hoping you all did a thumbs down. Not hoping. I don't want these birds to go away, but that's what has happened. And so here's the contemporary distribution of the loggerhead shrike, and contemporary meaning the 1995 to 1999 distribution. And we see that this bird has roughly decreased by about 60% on the landscape. And when you ask yourself, yeah, cool, grew up in Pasadena, that's basically where we live right now. When you think about, well, why? What is going on? What's the big? It's obvious. This is what the San Fernando Valley used to look like back then. And so late 1800s, definitely like ranching, but a lot of grassland. And this would be great for loggerhead shrike. Those of us that are familiar with that bird, you can imagine them perched up on one of these shrubs down in that grassy area. But now, of course, what does it look like? It's the just totally suburban dream in the San Fernando Valley. Trees planted everywhere, irrigated water, grassland's basically gone in that location. So big time habitat change led to big time change in the distribution for that bird. Okay, so how about wetlands? I'm going to focus on tricolored and yellow-headed blackbirds. So these birds were predicted to be in areas where there was freshwater, marsh, and lake. No surprise, of course. That's what we were expecting. And we could find these birds in the lower areas of the San Gabriel River. That was the main area of wetland aggregations, billabongs, things that were forming these water inlets, this intersection between the saltwater marshes on the coast and then where all this fresh water would come out. Think down near Long Beach in those areas, and then also the Bayona Marsh area. And these birds would have been common in both those locations. Now, when you look at their contemporary distribution, the up or the down, it's interesting for them because they've just shifted to these managed wetland locations. So if I go back and look historically, contemporary, you still see them in some locations. And so there really hasn't been a big change in terms of where they are. There are no tricolored blackbirds anymore. This is really just yellow-headed blackbirds in this area, but basically the birds are using these managed wetlands of the area. That's kind of a positive sign. It's just not positive. What's changed though is just where they historically used to be. Okay, so why? Well, here's a famous image of the Bayona wetlands. This is north of LAX, south of Venice Beach. It's still there. It's still a very, I would say, kind of fought over land. People have been thinking about what to do with the wetlands here for a long time. But when you look at it now, here's a picture of it. You still have some saltwater marsh, you still have some freshwater marsh, you still get some of these wetland birds in those areas. Okay, so one of my favorite birds, the yellow-billed cuckoo, and is predicted to be in riparian forest and wash. We would notice these birds historically, again, going down from the LA River, down past downtown, and then into the river mouth down near Long Beach, into the Long Beach, now the Long Beach Harbor, and also along the San Gabriel River, and then up into the Arroyo Seco. Are these birds still in the landscape? Of course not. These birds have basically been cut off. And this is back again in 1995 to 1999. We are noticing some positive signs about yellow-billed cuckoos coming back to some areas in the Santa Clara River and Southern California, not in LA area, but of course, one can dream. Excuse me. And you might say, okay, well, why? Well, back then, this is the San Gabriel River coming out of the San Gabriel Mountains. Look at that awesome gallery forest, meaning these big trees right along the river. And of course, now we've channelized everything. The whole idea is flood control, get the water out of LA as quick as possible, then bring it in from the Eastern Sierra, bring it in through the California Water Project from elsewhere where it can be heavily managed. And when you do something like this, and of course, put concrete all on the rivers, you're not going to have any habitat left. So of course, those birds are gone. Sad tale, but that's just what's been happening. A lot of people thinking about restoring and revitalizing these rivers, but it's just a big, big process to do all of that. Okay, a few more birds I'm going to show you, then we're going to get into summarizing everything. Okay, how about Anna's hummingbird? And of course, you guys are familiar with Anna's hummingbird, and they're going to be common where we're going to have these foothill and valley woodland areas. So that's mainly think of coastal, coast live oak, woodlands, some shrubby areas where these birds would breed. So their historic distribution would be along the Santa Monica Mountains, the Verdugo Mountains, and getting into the Puente Hills, and then also the foothills of the major mountain areas in Los Angeles. But now they're everywhere. And you look at them and they're all over the place. And there's been roughly almost a 70% increase in these birds. They basically occur in all areas of LA. And you might say, well, what's going on with that? There's been this huge expansion. So if we look at like Olive Avenue in Burbank, California, back in the day, this is what it looked like. You're not going to get Anna's hummingbirds in a place like this. But then you plant trees all over, coast live oaks, like you can see here in Olive Avenue. Anna's hummingbirds love coast live oaks. They love to breed in them. They love to forage for insects in them. They love to do a bunch of things. You put in exotic ornamental plants that have copious amounts of nectar, and of course those birds are going to use that. So you do that all across the city, and of course that's going to lead to an expansion of their habitat. So woodland birds definitely taking off over time as we've developed our urban forest. And the last bird I'm going to focus on is a hooded oriole or a synanthropic bird. These are synanthrope just means associated with people. And so hooded orioles, they were most historically associated with urban parcels. So they would be in the downtown LA area and then getting up into Pasadena. That's where the development was going on in the early part of the development of the city. And of course, when you compare that with now, their population, just like the Anna's hummingbird, has taken off like crazy. They've had over a 70% increase. They definitely occur in every single one of these areas. I don't know why some of them are that light pink color. And so you might say, why? Well, what's going on with them? Well, here's a famous image on Figueroa Street in the 1890s. And of course, you have those palms everywhere. And those of us that are familiar with hooded orioles know that they love nesting in palm trees. And so we only had those in a certain amount of area back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And of course, now this is what LA looks like throughout most of the city. And so these birds have just had their breeding habitat expanded like crazy. So they are able to take off. So what are we getting at with all of this? And I hope what's been clear with thinking about and me just cherry picking some birds is that there's been these massive changes in the avifaunal community in the area over time. It hasn't been all negative. It definitely has for some species. It's actually been quite positive for other species, but it's been a rapid shift. And that's really gone on throughout LA, throughout San Jose, throughout San Francisco, everywhere where there's been this massive and quick rapid urbanization over the past century or so. So in summary, the region's grasslands and riparian zones have been totally devastated. In fact, when you look at the entire analysis, the grassland birds are the ones all across the board that have just been hammered the most. And that's a similar story across much of the state. Some of other ecosystems still exist, but problems with invasive plants and urban pressures impede recovery. And it's just, you're never going to be able, there's a lot of hilltops in LA that have grasslands on the top. Mostly it's just non-native grasses and black mustard and stuff like that. And to actually restore that, it's almost impossible. You'd have to dig so deep down because there's just a huge seed bank. You'd have to burn and herbicide and all this stuff. And there's houses everywhere. So doing it is just, it almost seems impossible. So it's really just try to just keep what you have and not necessarily let things get to that point, because trying to restore that is just so difficult. So the third bullet point, the marsh systems, they've been totally hammered, but some evidence of birds will return to these restored areas in existing wetlands, which of course is good news. Woodland birds persist and have totally expanded in some areas of the city. It's not just Anna's hummingbird. LA is a strange example. It's so arid down here, but it really is one of the largest and most diverse urban forests on the planet because of all the water that's been irrigated and brought from afar here. And so you could just plant trees from all over the place. And so a lot of birds have been able to just totally expand their populations because of that. And those synanthropic birds, like the hooded oriole, but anything else, mockingbirds, all of those types of birds that are kind of, what you'd expect to see in cities, they've obviously taken off. All right, so I'm not going to talk about those conservation implications. I'm just going to point to you all to this project. It's called the Mapping Los Angeles Landscape History. We have a website. We have a report for a project we just did where a lot of these results were. We're writing up these results into a paper right now, and there's a lot more here. It's been a really cool project to be a part of. Okay, so I want to shift gears just for we're more than halfway done with the talk, but just for the latter half of the talk. And I want to talk about this idea. We're just discussing these huge changes in urban areas. And I just want to talk about three research items that we're working on. And this idea about hope and how you can have these cities and build these cities, again, where you're developing them, where you're going to make all these big changes that are going to hopefully benefit people, but definitely benefit birds, insects, and everything else that we really care about. So first, I'm going to talk about native plants and residential yards and birds, and also pollinators. I'm going to get into this idea about biodiversity and the luxury effect, and what is the luxury effect, and why is that something we study? And then I'm just going to end it talking about food webs of LA and some projects that we are working on. So first, about native plants and residential yards in LA, I'm just going to highlight research from a graduate student, Noriko Smallwood, and she's another NorCal girl. She's from Davis. And so Noriko published this really cool paper, The Ecological Role of Native Plant Landscaping in Residential Yards to Birds During the Non-Breeding Period. And in a nutshell, what was this all about? Well, when you go throughout much of LA, and this is of course the same in San Jose and different parts of the Bay Area, most of the residential yards look like this: just some lawn, maybe some hedges, maybe some ornamental plants, but the pretty low maintenance yard where you can have someone come in and leaf blow and mow the lawn and then move on, and then you have your yard. But there's a big push at the city level and also within certain neighborhoods. This is certainly going on in my neighborhood, to go native. And so to have a yard that looks something more like this, where you have native trees, native plants, native shrubs that resemble the historical ecosystems of that area. And of course, when you do something like this, you convert a yard on the left from something that might look like what you have on the right. Of course, that's going to affect birds and everything else, but we wanted to put a number on it, and we wanted to do some research on that. So we went out and we compared these two types of yards and how birds feed on the different plants and where they're getting their food from. So thinking about more just this energy transfer and where they're getting most of their energy from. And then we also wanted to look at pollinators too, and so insects as well. So I'll show you results from both of that. Okay, so when we're looking at the percent, so on the y-axis right here, the percent of bird feeding observations. So this is us just staring in these yards at birds feeding on different plants. They're not actually feeding on the leaves. They're feeding on either insects that are on the plants, like bush tits moving through and picking off little insects, or maybe there's some fruit on a plant that they're interested in, or a seed that they're interested in. So that's what we're looking at here. So there's much higher, and the way to read this plot right here is that the native plants have higher bird feeding observations than those non-native plants. So you'll see species like quercus, that's oak, salvia, sage, heteromyles, which is going to be toyon, arctostaphylos, which is going to be manzanita, and eriogonum, buckwheat, which are going to be really commonly planted in some of these native landscape yards, are hosting a lot of the bird feeding activity. And not a lot going on for the non-native plants at all, just some grasses. But you really do see that if you go out, you might see some birds there, but if you really watch them, they're not doing a whole lot of feeding. They're not doing a whole lot of nesting. They're really not using a lot of those non-native plants. And if you look at this from kind of a different type of lens through a different type of analysis, the way you want to read this is percent plant cover. The native plants are these purple dots. These orange dots are the non-native plants. And so as you have more of these native plants covering the yard, like sage, like oak, like toyon, like manzanita, like the eriogonum, you're going to get more birds feeding in your yard. And we see that all over the place whenever we go out and do our counts and do our research. And I think like for a crowd like this, for a breeding or a bird observatory, this isn't news. This isn't news to any of us that are thinking about this stuff. We've known about this for decades, but it's been slow to get some of this information out that like these are the benefits. This is what it really does for some of our birds. Okay, so yeah, unsurprisingly, birds love that. And if you just convert these yards, it could have from that conventional to the native landscape yard, just massive effects on insect and bird populations. And so insects, what about insects? So I just want to show you this really cool figure, which gets at this idea about these networks, about insects and birds too, so Allen's hummingbirds and Anna's hummingbirds, and the different plants they visit to feed, and also by feeding, getting the pollen all over them, and then doing some pollination. So what you want to look at here, and what this circular figure is with these different circles, over here, these larger circles are different types of insects. These are honeybees. These are hoverflies. Birds are somewhere in here. These smaller circles are all the different plants that they visited. And that's just us watching and observing where honeybees are going, where the Allen's hummingbird is going, where the Anna's hummingbird is going. The 398 ties is the number of interactions, so the times where there was an actual feeding attempt happening. And so pollination that was going on. We actually can't confirm it was pollination, but at least feeding that was going on. And those nodes, those 165 nodes, those are just, quote, the important plants that were getting multiple types of feeding. So how would this look compared to that conventional yard? Well, those yards, of course, are much simpler. So when you see that here, we see this idea that there's hardly any feeding or pollination going on in these areas. So 40 nodes, 52 ties. What's the difference here? For some reason, okay, there we go. So we have up to 8 times greater number of interactions in these yards. So these are just by interactions, meaning a bee going to a flower, a bird going to a flower, in these native landscape yards and those conventional yards. So what should you do right now? Go out and do this. Go out and plant some of these native plants. It's awesome, and it really does make a difference for our feeding birds and also for these pollinators. All right, so I'm going to just wrap this up soon. I'm not even totally sure what time we started because we started a little late, but I just have a couple more slides to share with you all. So next, I want to talk about this idea that we do a lot of research on, biodiversity and the luxury effect. So what is the luxury effect? The luxury effect is this idea that there's a positive relationship between affluence and organismal diversity or activity in urban ecosystems. And basically, if you go to a very rich area of a city, you might see trees and all this greenery everywhere, and you're going to get lots more wildlife living in those areas. Now, in the US, there's definitely a historical tie to this. And so there's some famous papers that came out recently. This one was in 2021. And what this is looking at are sections of a city. Let's just focus on Los Angeles first, up here in the upper left, that were green lined. So that means high investment going into these areas. These were areas that are primarily white, primarily Western European families, et cetera. So they were getting a lot of the money historically back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And then areas that were redlined, which were locations that were primarily communities of color, and the yellow and the blue areas. And hopefully what you're seeing and what we're looking at here is the amount of tree cover in these locations. So in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Cleveland, and New York City, there's more tree cover in these wealthier areas. This is an idea about the luxury effect. So we're interested in this in LA because you can see this all over the place. You can be in a very wealthy part of LA and just go right across the street, and all of a sudden you're like wondering what on earth just happened. Things have changed so much. This is potentially what has happened because this was going on all throughout LA. So let's just get into a couple ideas for some of our research. First, I'm going to talk about street trees. And so street trees, as you're all familiar with, are just those trees on the strip right in front of your house that the city plants, but you're responsible for, and they can come and just cut the branches and do whatever they want, even though you take care of it, all that stuff. So we've done a lot of work with street trees in LA because they're all over the place. And what we've noticed is that there are far more street tree density in high income areas of the city rather than low income areas. Keep in mind, these are public resources, these street trees, and so the city should be planting them, but it's up to you to maintain them. In low-income areas of LA, there's high rates of renting. It's very different in high-income areas where there's a lot of owner-occupied homes. People have the means to afford landscapers, watering, and all that stuff in these high-income areas. So it's natural to think, well, this has to affect birds, right? Of course it does. So when you're looking at migratory birds during the winter time, there's way more of them in these high-income areas in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, Bel Air, places that are famous. You're going to find all these birds rather than places like South LA, East LA, etc. So we've done a lot of work on this, and we also want to look at it through that historical lens of redlining. So I'm going to show you some stuff where we've gone and counted birds and measured habitat all over LA. And what is the story when we're looking at habitat and redlining? So I'm going to show you guys some more graphs here. So these A and B locations right here, these were areas of high investment historically back in the 30s and 40s. These C and D locations, these were the red line locations. And these not graded locations were just places in LA that we've surveyed birds and habitat that were not part of this lending practice. So the land value now is still much higher in these areas that were green lined back in the day. The square footage of homes is much larger in locations that were green lined back in the day. The tree canopy is much greater in these areas that were green lined back in the day. And the impervious surface cover, the amount of pavement, the amount of asphalt, the area where water is not going to seep into the ground is much higher in these red-lined areas. So again, this is just like what we were seeing in that earlier paper. It's certainly going on here in Los Angeles, where in these red-lined areas, you have lower land values, smaller homes, less tree canopy, more impervious surface. It's the same story up in Oakland and up in the Bay Area where the redlining stuff was going on big time as well. Okay, so how about birds? What are they going to do? They're going to go where birds got it good. They're just going to stick their wings out and fly to where it suits their needs. Some birds love it where there's going to be trees and shrubs. They're going to find the food resources they want. Some are going to love it where there's high building density. Think of pigeons, etc. But at least for a lot of the birds that we study, like some forest birds, these are migratory birds like a yellow-rumped warbler, you're going to find those in those green-lined zones and not so much in the red-lined parts of LA. And it's a flip for these quote birds that like urban conditions, like house finches, those birds that we see all the time in the cities. They're going to be much more dense in these red-lined locations. So what's the story there in LA? Well, redlining certainly has an impact on what's going on in terms of the distribution of birds in the area. So that luxury effect idea, that's certainly a thing here. You get lower migratory bird abundance, higher urban bird abundance, and a whole host of other things that are going on. I didn't link the paper here, but we had a paper come out last year about this. There's some cool write-ups in the New York Times and the LA Times about it in terms of some of the findings for it. So if you're interested, I think if you just typed in redlining and birds, you might be able to find the paper and read a little bit more about it. Okay. So last, and I apologize if I'm going a little over time, but I just want to share one last thing about what we're working on now. And we're really trying to piece together this idea about food webs in LA and really getting to that native plant question. And so we have a project right now where we're planting trees all throughout our campus, and we're wrapping netting around some of the trees, and then some of the trees do not have netting on, and the netting is to keep the birds off. So we're letting the insect herbivores do their thing, eat up the leaves on the plants. That's what we're kind of interested in, because we want to compare differences between non-native trees and native trees, and basically trees that they're planting all over the city. And really what we're trying to get at is this advocacy for why are we doing and planting all these trees that take up a lot of water that provide no benefit to our wildlife. We kind of want to get at that a little bit more. So we have this big project. We're working on it right now. It's quite exciting. I'm going to be out there tomorrow morning doing some work on it. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm not going to go through the details of this slide, but I just want to end it, this talk, that we're doing a lot of things at Cal State L.A. and also just down in Los Angeles in general with thinking about these urban ecosystems. You might say, what's this parking kiosk? What's this building? Well, this is the building for the new Urban Ecology Center of LA, and I'm one of the new directors of it, and I'm one of the co-directors of it. And what we're doing at the Urban Ecology Center is we're thinking about three things. We're thinking about ways to reach our students at Cal State LA and other centers for higher education, and also K through 12 education, on the importance of biodiversity within cities. We are working with the local communities. So this is the second thing, about community engagement and about teaching our communities the same thing about why biodiversity is so important in the context of our enjoyment of life and our quality of life in cities. And last, about research, a lot of the stuff that I love doing, and my graduate students and I love doing, thinking about research questions. We want to be this node for bringing people together to think about ways for doing important research that's going to help us with developing our cities. There's been so many people that have been a part of all these different studies that I've been sharing with you. And this is just a collection of some of the students in the lab. And I believe Lara gave a talk for you guys at some point down here. So maybe you recognize Lara. But anyway, it's been really fun working with all these students, and we're just going to keep on doing what we're doing. So with that, I will take any questions if you have them. And thank you very much for your time.
The question is, did you include the invasive parrots in any of your studies?
Did, and some of our tree stuff. And the parrots are interesting because we notice them throughout LA for sure, and they do use. We basically had a question of whether they're tracking their ecological niche from wherever they're from. If they were from Mexico, feeding on certain plants in Mexico, to plants that would be planted in LA that were similar, either planted from Mexico or another place. We've done a little bit of work on that. And the student who was actually working on that decided to switch their major to engineering. And so they left that project. But we have included them, and we have not really found. We have to do a deeper dive, I guess, to think about it. But they're all over LA. There's an interesting project down here called the California Parrot Project, and the Moore Lab of Ornithology at Occidental College is doing quite a bit of work on that too, which is pretty cool.
Excellent, thank you. If the other people have questions, they can put them in the chat. We're getting a lot of people thanking you for your talk and saying what a fantastic talk it was. We all noted there were so many similarities between what's going on down in Southern California and things that we're looking at up here. I did have one question looking at grasslands, because we had Lynn Trulio who talked about burrowing owls up here, and looking at the wintering owls using the area, but not the breeding owls not using them much. When we're looking at grasslands, I know that you kind of shared it's kind of dire that we just want to hold on to what we have, but is there anything that people in our community can do to try to turn that around at all, or are we really looking at just losing those species?
It's really hard because some of the best grasslands in the state are actually those serpentine grasslands in just south of San Jose, like Pacheco Pass, some of those areas. And you can really go out there and see some of what it used to look like in those areas, because a lot of the invasive grasses have not been able to really take over just due to the soils out there, those serpentine rocks. You can see that down a Carrizo Plain as well, getting a little bit further down south. But really, once you get down towards Southern California, lots of people spending a lot of money in different groups on restoration projects, but it's just very, very complicated. And it's complicated for those reasons I was talking about, that the seed bank is just immense with these invasive plants. So you can go out there and pull the grasses, burn the grasses, do all that stuff, plant it with native grasses. But just those seeds come right back up from all those annuals. So it's just a very, very tricky thing. So grasslands, we've got a lot of grasslands throughout the state, but most of them are those annual grasses and those non-native grasses. And so it's a very tricky thing to try to get back to what we think it used to be. It must have been magnificent at some point. Stories of hope, though, in downtown LA, there's a very famous school, Esperanza Middle School, and their principal there, Brad Rumble, an amazing person, part of LA Audubon, which I'm part of. And Brad has gotten a lot of money to take this school area that's just asphalt, nothing, plant native plants, native grasses, and they've had a burrowing owl hanging out at their school right in downtown LA. So you can do things like that and make a big difference. So it's pretty cool.
It's wonderful. Well, what's encouraging to see that some of the things that we're doing are bringing some of the species back in terms of our own gardens. And I know that's something we want to continue to push. And we're going to be sharing your talk with our larger community and sharing that message that people need to stay on top of that and keep trying, because it is making a difference.
If you can, and one of the things that we, I kind of have more time to dive into some of those studies. I think if you just look at all the residential yards in a place like LA, and it goes forever, the amount of houses. And if you could just convert 1%, 2%, 3% of those yards, and then if you were doing that in the public spaces, in the libraries, in schools, those places, you would really make a difference in terms of creating habitat for those insect pollinators, for birds, etc. One thing we notice in Los Angeles, which is probably very similar up in the Bay Area, is that most of our research is during the winter time, because there's millions of birds that come down to hang out here in the winter, because it's awesome down here in the winter, nice weather and all that. That's why people live here. But we don't see a lot of breeding bird activity throughout all of, there's some places in the city where it's quite good, but that's an area where, again, if you were doing those yard conversions, I think you would start noticing a difference for things like birds successfully breeding and doing well. Not just like your house finches and black phoebes and birds that are already doing fine in the cities, but birds like, I don't know, like an oak titmouse or something that might be having trouble because they just don't have the amount of habitat that they need.
Yeah, it's very encouraging to know that we can actually make that impact, and we don't have to think that it's just creating natural spaces and refuges, but actually in the urban spaces we can do this kind of work. There is another question here. Did you mention projects around restoring riparian areas? The person joined a little bit late. If you want to kind of touch on that again.
Yeah, so I can share some stories from Los Angeles about that, and I know you guys have done a lot of work on that as well up at SFBBO. And what's the name of the creek or the river that you guys work on a lot? I can't even remember.
Coyote Creek? Coyote Creek?
Yeah, that's right, Coyote Creek. Yeah, that's really cool. So in LA, and this is really kind of recent and cool, there's a lot of work and a lot of money being put into the LA River for revitalization. So Frank Gehry is one of the famous architects who's got a vision for the whole thing. There's a lot of people, working on it. I think a lot of it's maybe tied to the Olympics that are eventually going to be here, and kind of thinking differently about the future of the city and how they want to present it to the world. But there's a couple patches of land that have been restored with riparian habitat. And these are patches of land that were severely degraded. And now they host Bell's vireos, and now they host yellow warblers all over the place. And now they're hosting, and these are breeding birds. And so this is great, to have some of these birds coming in. And the Bell's vireos, the least Bell's vireos, have been successful in breeding there. So you can certainly introduce components of those riparian, I'm going to say forests, because you have trees in those areas that they were doing the restoration work. And a lot of these really special birds are coming back. I really want cuckoos to come back, but they need a lot of area. And so I'm just not quite sure that we're going to get there with them in LA in the short term. But that's the vision, is that eventually you can build enough habitat back to bring a bird like that back to the area.
Excellent. Well, folks, you can put your questions in the chat. And as we're waiting for that, I had one other question. In terms of futures for research and young scientists coming up, do you feel the kind of research that you're doing and looking at our urban spaces as the place to do the work is something that's growing? Has it always been important, or is this like the direction that we're going in terms of trying to head these problems off at the pass?
It's always been important, but the state of ecology has not always seen urban areas as a place to do real science. And so a lot of our theories in ecology, a lot of what we know, those have been done in far off protected areas or in the rainforest or places where that's kind of how it was done for a long time. That's completely different now. And so we all live in urban areas, whether they're big cities like LA, the Bay Area, or whether they're smaller rural areas, college towns like San Luis Obispo, whatever they might be. And every single one of those places is critically important for thinking about our role in terms of where we're living and what we're doing and living in the natural world and how we can manage our cities and our places, because we're the ones doing it. We're the ecosystem engineers. We're the ones that are thinking, can we put native plants here? Can we restore this riparian area, this grassland area? We've of course got the choices to do that. So I think the field of urban ecology is easily the most exciting field out there right now if you care about conservation and applied outcomes, because a lot of the work that we do here in LA, like the street tree stuff, for example, I didn't share with you all the nitty gritty of that paper about which trees the birds really like, which ones they tend to avoid. That stuff just goes straight to the urban foresters in Los Angeles, and then they use it for making their decisions about what they're going to do. So you can really, I think, make a big difference if you're doing this type of work. Now, up in the Bay Area, there's a lot. There's a great lab at UC Berkeley, Chris Schell, who's doing a lot of this stuff. There's a couple of great labs at San Francisco State University. I'm not totally sure about San Jose State, but I'm sure people are doing this. But it's kind of everywhere now. I feel like every single day there's a new paper in urban ecology that comes out, and it used to not be like that.
It's very exciting, and it's one of the things we think about here at SFBBO and looking at our urban environment, that's one of the pluses that we have here, and also that we have so many people here who want to get engaged and looking at that as part of our resources that we have to try to tackle these things.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but do you want to leave us with any kind of thoughts about how you'd like us to get involved with the work that you're doing down there? And I will be sending an email to everyone who registered, and I can share links to any information that you want them to have as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just kind of leave on a message of hope that, I think it's easy to look at a place like the Bay Area, just flying over to LA and just think it's ruined. From a natural history point of view, you just think, oh, we've completely messed up the Bay, or we've completely messed up, the rivers in LA or whatever it is. And so I think it's easy to take that line of thinking, but I just don't. And I think a lot of us and especially I'm sure everybody in this audience, we see that, you put one native milkweed species in the ground and all of a sudden a day later a monarch shows up to it. And it can be a little thing like that can make a big difference. And so I feel super inspired when I look at my students and I look at groups like you and groups like LA Audubon and different groups that are doing this type of work, because I feel like all of us, especially if we're all thinking about this, we're all going to do things maybe a little different or focus on projects that are specific towards our areas, but that's what it takes. And so if we're all doing that and we're all thinking about this in ways where we really, there's the line of thinking that we're separate from the natural world, that's no more. We know we have to get this right to really kind of move off into the future. And so I just think if we're all doing this, we're all thinking about what's important in our areas, and we're all chipping in, I just think we're going to do a lot of awesome stuff together. So I feel inspired.
We've got a lot of comments thanking you for that, Hope. Thank you so much for joining the community today and sharing everything that you're doing. We're excited to learn about it, and we wish you great success as you move forward on what you're doing. And we hope that you can do stuff with us in the future again. So thank you again for coming, Eric. And thanks everyone for joining us.
SFBBO is a nonprofit. With your support, we will continue to inform decision makers, inspire people to act, and involve diverse communities in our work. Please visit our website to learn more and get involved today.